a very common mistake that parents make is that they think their children might be afraid of darkness and they must sleep with a little light in the room. And so they buy these lights out of Amazon and they put them in the room, and the room of the child is never dark. And these children, they have problems with sleep because their circadian rhythm is heavily perturbed. Light is the best way to perturb and screw up your circadian rhythm.
Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host Jitendra. This is a conversation with Giorgio Gilestro. He is an associate professor at Imperial College London. His work focuses on sleep and consciousness. In this conversation, we talk about what is sleep, importance of sleep, how we can measure it, impact of sleep deprivation, and sleep for healthy lifestyle. Enjoy the conversation. Share and subscribe to support the podcast. Thank you for listening. Hi, Giorgio. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jitendra. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's directly dive into the topic. So what makes you work on sleep?
So sleep is a fascinating problem of biology, of course. And it's one of those few problems, I would say, that is very much explored but not very well understood. And so when I finished my PhD and it was time to start thinking about what to do next, I thought this could be a brilliant problem to dive in, not just for the scientific aspect, because clearly it is an interesting problem, but also because it was a good time for me to start working on sleep. So this was in 2006 when I started my postdoc, and flies were really just only recently been proposed as a model to study sleep function and sleep regulation. And so it was quite timely, and I thought that it's the kind of problem that would probably keep us busy for a long time. So it was a good investment. So it wasn't my decision to start studying sleep was obviously very much driven by scientific interest, but also a bit strategic. I think when you start your own your first postdoc, you hopefully think of joining a scientific topic that then will be the topic of your own lab, if that's what you want to do. And so that was really the main reasoning behind me choosing sleep as a field.
Yeah, and so when it comes to this question, what is sleep? I think it boggles everyone's mind, right? So let's hear it from the leading expert in the field. So how do you define sleep?
Right. So this is not just a problem of a definition. It's really the major issue that is at the base of everything we do. And the reason is that we don't really have a very good definition of what sleep is because we don't know what sleep does. And it's very difficult in biology to define something completely from scratch without any understanding on their function. Sometimes we need to have at least some understanding of the function in an evolutionary related way to be able to recognize a principle or a phenomenon or something in biology. Think of the wing of a chicken. A chicken doesn't use the wing to fly, but still we can recognize that it has wings, even if it doesn't use them to fly. Just that's because we know enough about what wings do in other animals. But for sleep, it's different. We don't know about sleep, and that is true for humans, but it's also true for any animal. So we don't know what sleep does in any animals, and so it's very difficult to extrapolate really a proper biological definition of sleep. So what we can do, that's the best we can do, is to work by extrapolation and correlation. So we extrapolate that sleep happens in other animals and in other individuals in the same way it happens in us. So, right, sleep, if you think about it, is a very subjective experience. And I know that I am asleep during the night, but I have to extrapolate that you're doing the same when I see you doing something that looks like very much like what I do. But that's, again, is an extrapolation. And it becomes even more of an extrapolation when I start looking at this in other animals, right? And so animals that are somehow closer to us show a behavioral correlate that is, say, similar to ours. And so it's easiest to extrapolate. But as we go away in the evolutionary tree, in the animal kingdom, to animals who are very different from us, who have a sleep behavior that is different from us, then the extrapolation becomes more and more daring. And so, that's why, for instance, for decades, people did not consider insects as sleeping animals because they didn't dare doing this extrapolation. And now we got to a point where we can actually start to be confident about the behavioral correlates of sleep. And so you start reading paper about sleep in jellyfish, or in, even C. elegans, so in animals that are very, very distant from us. And scientifically, we feel more confident about extrapolating and they also sleep. But again, it's really an assumption, and it is based mostly on behavioral correlates. So if you define sleep by behavioral correlates, there are, let's say, 5 definitions of sleep that I would say that the 2 most important ones are that sleep has to be associated to a period of inactivity, and that this period of inactivity must be homeostatically regulated, which means that if I or an animal sleep more in the afternoon, then I will have a harder time falling asleep in the evening. Or conversely, if I stay up and awake all night, then I will have a harder time staying awake the day after. I will feel like sleeping. So these 2 phenomena of sleep homeostasis and general inactivity are the most commonly, let's say, conserved behavioral correlates. And these are also the most commonly used behavioral correlates to define what sleep is. And so at the moment, until we really have a biological underpinning, the best way to answer your question on what is sleep is this: sleep is something that looks like that. But what it really does and what it really is, we don't know.
Yeah, and let's add in one more term there, circadian rhythms. So how sleep is related to circadian rhythms? Yeah,
so of those 5 definitions of sleep, I mentioned only 2, but there are more. And one of those 5 is that sleep is related to circadian rhythm. So it's controlled by the internal clock. And we know that this is the case pretty much for any animal we looked at. In fact, I will go as far as saying that sleep is the main behavioral output of any circadian clock, in a way that at least is the most recognizable one. The thing is that animals sleep, and when they do sleep, they sleep in a stereotypical way, which is driven by the clock. So normally they, always sleep at night, or some other animals, they always sleep at day, depending on their ecology. But their sleep pattern is periodic and is controlled by the circadian clock. So it is the circadian clock that we regulate mostly that when it's the right time to go to sleep. The other factor that together with the circadian clock contributes to this regulation is the homeostatic process. So normally we say that sleep is regulated by these 2 phenomena. On one end, the circadian clock, and on the other end, with the homeostatic process, and these 2 combine to make you more or less sleepy. We normally really experience on ourselves only the first one, the circadian clock. The moments when we do experience also the other one, the homeostatic regulation, is either because we had a disturbed sleep pattern. So for instance, we stay up all night partying or studying for an exam, and then the day after we feel this excessive sleep pressure at the moment where we normally will not have sleep pressure. Or jet lag is another way, right? If you travel to another country, now you feel the disconnect between the circadian drive and the homeostatic drive, and you are feeling asleep at a time where you normally wouldn't, because that's what your circadian clock still commands you to do.
Yeah, and when we think of sleep, and as you already mentioned, that it is conserved in other animals as well. So what basically changes? Is it I expect that all of us, even the animals, they kind of have the same 24-hour cycle, right? So what changes during that 24 hours when we look across the species?
Yeah, so the circadian clock is really something that is difficult to escape because it's linked to the rotation of the planet, and that's something that has been with us for a very long time. So, so that it's something that probably, if you think about biology, there are many things that should be flexible when it comes to biological drives and needs, access to food, access to water, access to mates. Those are all things that might or might not happen with a certain regular pattern. But everything else, everything that is connected to the circadian clock is supposed to be very well constant. You don't expect the planet to start a different rotating period from one day to the next. So the 24 hours of the circadian clock are really thoroughly embedded in our biology, let's say. So you can expect that all animals will follow the same period of 24 hours. There are exceptions, relatively recent, of some animals who do not experience light, because light is the main Zeitgeber. Those animals, they might then use other different stimuli to entrain themselves to 24 hours period. But some animals, like for instance, cave fish, who live in the depth of a very dark and remote cave, they have no stimuli whatsoever from the external world, not in terms of light, not even in terms of temperature. So the temperature is constant, the darkness is constant. So these animals, they are slowly escaping from say anything circadianly related. And it's interesting because then these animals end up sleeping very little, if anything. So cave fish are among the animals that sleep the least among all the animals we know of. So they sleep less than 2 hours, probably even less than 1 hour a day.
Then this definitely raises this question that whether sleep is a necessity or not for life, especially.
Yeah, so I would say that most of my scientific activity is being driven by this very important question, not just mine. I think most laboratories who study sleep, they stay up at night thinking about this question. And as you said, evolution is really a key component to approach this question. I agree with you. I also believe that if we are to understand this phenomenon, if you are to answer this question, we have to look at it from the evolutionary point of view. And if you do look at it from the evolutionary point of view, then extremes across evolution become very interesting. The cave fish is one of them, but there are many. So elephants, for instance, and giraffes, they also sleep very little. They sleep as little as 2 hours a day. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have animals like bats, who are reported to be sleeping up to 20 hours a day. Now, I mean, studying bats is not straightforward. So the literature on sleep in bats is still lacking, and there is some controversy. But clearly, they sleep a lot. If it's not 20 hours, it's definitely in that range. And so any hypothesis of sleep function has to come to terms with this variability. Any hypothesis of sleep function must explain why an animal takes 20 hours to do what another animal does in 2 hours, right? So any hypothesis of sleep function has to come to terms with the fact that a bat needs 20 hours to do what an elephant does in 2 hours. And I think this is a crucial aspect of sleep. I would say there is only two ways to explain this puzzling effect. One is to say that nature has learned to make sleep more efficient in some animals. So nature has learned to achieve in 2 hours what other animals need 20 hours for. And the other hypothesis is that sleep serves different functions in different animals at different times. There is another puzzling finding, again, from evolution, which I think goes in the same direction, is very important. And that is that migratory birds, for instance, who normally would sleep for 12 hours or more a day, more or less like us, at one point in their life, they go through a period where they had an instinct to migrate. And when they do have this instinct, they, for instance, migrate from South America all the way to Alaska. and that it's it's a trip that takes several weeks, during which they reduce the sleep time by 95% almost. So they end up sleeping minutes a day rather than hours a day, and they can go on like this for weeks. When they do arrive at destination, because they flew in order to find mating partners, then they have to adopt a use, snooze, you lose philosophy, and they have even more incentive not to fall asleep, because otherwise they will be outcompeted for mating partners. And so again, after such a demanding trip, and after having done this with so little sleep, they will go on for further days and days without any sleep. And so these are animals that instinctively change their sleeping pattern from several hours a day to minutes a day. And again, how do they do this? Either, same hypothesis before, so either sleep has found a way to be more efficient in these animals all of a sudden, and they can do in minutes what they would normally do in hours, or sleep in these animals has a different function, and this function can be, some of them can be forgo, and they don't have to be accomplished at all. And I think this is really the second aspect. The second hypothesis is the only one viable, because the first one, the argument against the first one is that if nature really had found a way to make us sleep in minutes rather than hours, then we will always do that, right? We would always just get done with a few minutes. But the fact that it cannot, it means that it's the second idea. And the second idea really brought us everything which is at the base of our experiments, and it's something we call a tripartite model of sleep function. So we postulate that sleep has three functions. One function is vital, so it's something that is biologically fundamental. So think of something like, repair membrane, or repair DNA, or repair mitochondria, or something really, from year one textbook level. Something without which your cells will die, not just you, but even your cells will die. So that is, in principle, a vital function of sleep. And then there is a function that is useful. And so think of species-specific aspects like improving memory, or improving the immune system. Things like might apply to us, but might not apply to a fly, or vice versa, obviously. And finally, there is a third component which we call accessory sleep, which actually account in our hypothesis for most of the sleep we get. And that is sleep that we don't actually need, but we have because it's convenient to stay out of trouble, to save energy, to stay put. And so if you start thinking of sleep in this way, then you can see how a elephant can get without all of the accessory sleep. And so also a migratory bird can basically suddenly remove all of the accessory sleep and maintain only that brief component, which is vital or useful, and perhaps even the useful one can be scrapped off for several days or weeks. And so that elasticity and this modular aspects of sleep is really the hypothesis that is driving all of my science at the moment.
Yeah, and when you say that the sleep may be a sort of way for body to kind of repair or activate those repair mechanisms. So if we then go at the cellular level, which of course it'll be a bit difficult, but then do you expect that or if someone has done some sort of experiments to show if there are different rates of these repair mechanisms or some experiments?
Yeah, most of the literature that addresses sleep function has been focusing on things at this level in the past. So things related to cellular biology, cellular well-being, cellular welfare. Because if you have to postulate that sleep is a vital process that is common to all animals, then normally you will come up with something like that, right? With something very basic that is common to all, if not all cells, at least all neurons. And so if you go through and browse the literature over the past, say, a couple of centuries, you will find that most sleep hypotheses that were put forward were belonging in this category. And so things like DNA repair, clearance of toxins from the extracellular space, membrane repair, mitochondria, repair from oxidative stress. these are all basic cellular function and which people postulated might be important for sleep. Regulation of synaptic number. The problem with that is that, so there's two problems with that. The first one is you have to explain why all of this can only be done while the animal is asleep, right? So you have to explain that whatever that is, DNA repair, you will have to say, well, the cell can do DNA repair only when you are asleep. And that is very difficult. Why would why would the cell do that? It doesn't make sense. The other problem is, again, that it has to be something compatible with the amount of time we spend asleep. So if you say that the function of sleep is to repair the DNA, and then you have to explain why it takes, again, 20 hours in a bat, or 14 hours in a newborn, or something like that. Is it really just something that takes so long? And at the end of the day, none of these hypotheses really survive, exactly for this reason, because no one really could come down and show that you need all of the sleep to do something like that. For as important as might be, it just doesn't make sense. And so the only way to make sense of this is to think that, yes, some sleep is required for these actions to take place. It might be multiple actions. It might be actions that are actually different from species to species. It might be actions that are actually not just for neurons, but for all cells. Okay, it's possible that this is happening, but not all of the sleep. It's just really a minimum part of sleep. Most sleep would really just be there because it's ecologically and evolutionary convenient. It provides better fitness in evolutionary term to just spend a good chunk of your life out of trouble. And sleep is a time when we are out of trouble. Most reviews they will say that sleep is actually a dangerous time when you are basically exposing yourself to predators. But that's not true. Sleep is one of the safest time because most animals will find a safe spot to fall asleep. They will be in a nest, they will be in a cave, they will be in a point where they're actually not even visible. And it's rare that an animal actually gets preyed on during sleep. So if you think about it, it makes sense. It makes sense from the ecological point of view to think of this in these terms.
Yeah, and most of the people, they are trying to show the function of sleep through sleep deprivation experiments, and which of course your group also works on. So let's try to frame what these sleep deprivation experiments are.
Yeah, so that's is really one of the fundamental rules of biology is that if you want to study something, you have to remove it from the system, right? So it's like trying to understand what the radio does. You have to open the radio and you start removing pieces and bits and pieces and try to understand what happens when you remove bits and pieces. And so the same applies to behavior and to biology, to genetics. You want to understand what sleep does. The first thing you do is you take it away. And a lot of the literature in the past century was done in this way, based on sleep deprivation. Normally, we have two ways of doing sleep deprivation, let's say two frames. One is what we call acute sleep deprivation, and the other is chronic sleep deprivation. There's also other aspects like sleep disturbance or sleep restrictions, but normally in the lab, you move between acute and chronic, let's say. Acute is where you just remove you might be removing like a few hours of sleep, or maybe one night of sleep, or an entire day of sleep. And chronic is when you just remove all of the sleep that you can for as long as you can. So if you want to study some of the sleep function, acute might be the best way to go about. So if you want to study, for instance, what we call the useful function of sleep, like the effect on learning and memory, the effect on the immune system, then acute sleep deprivation might be a good way to do it. You just keep the animals awake for an entire night, and then you see the day after whether their behavioral performance, whether their cognitive performance, for instance, was affected. For other more fundamental aspects, then you have to go into chronic sleep deprivation, meaning that you keep the animals awake for as long as you can. And this is something that we can do in Drosophila. Now it's becoming more and more difficult to do with other animals. Before ethical reason, because we know from decades of studies that chronic sleep deprivation is extremely stressful. The first experiment of chronic sleep deprivation were done at the end of 1800 on dogs, and the dogs will die. So those were the first evidence that people bring when they say that sleep deprivation is eventually lethal. And they will die in a very miserable way. You know, they will just have some kind of systemic syndrome, and it will be very difficult, I think, to distinguish whether they will die out of sleep deprivation or whether they will die out of excessive stress. And the same applies even to a bit more control experiments that were done in the 1960s on rodents and rats in particular. Also there, and these are probably the most important experiments we have in the field, it was shown that after more or less 21 days of sleep deprivation, the rats will die. Again, they will die like those dogs. They will die in a miserable way. They will lose fur. They will change their metabolic status. They will, their body temperature will raise. Their entire metabolism will be affected. And again, it will be very difficult to say whether all these were consequences of sleep deprivation or of an excess of stress. Stress also linked to not just to the fact that you're removing sleep by itself, which we know is a stressful procedure, but also by the way you remove sleep. So these rodents, for instance, were put in a platform, and the platform was moving whenever the animals would fall asleep. And then the animals were either the choice to wake up and react, or to keep sleeping and then immediately fall into a pool of water. And so these animals, by the end of the experiment, they fell into water some, dozens or hundreds of times a day. So it's very stressful condition, very stressful paradigm. This is one of the reasons why, as I said, it's very difficult to do these chronic experiments in mammals at the moment. I don't think they can be done anymore. With flies, we have more of a green light when it comes to these things, so we can do these experiments. My lab has done these experiments in flies a few years ago, and we show that flies don't really die out of sleep deprivation, out of chronic sleep deprivation, not in the way you would expect. In male flies, we found no effect on longevity when we removed completely all of their sleep. And in female flies, we found only a minor effect on longevity when we removed all of the sleep. Now, when I say all of the sleep, I cheat a little bit, because you cannot ever remove all of the sleep from an animal, because sleep might happen in what we call micro intervals. And so sleep might happen for episodes which are as short as few seconds. And so you will not be able to remove those episodes. So you will always leave animals some micro episodes of sleep that you cannot interfere with. And that was the case with our experiment as well. We left animals micro episodes of 20 seconds, after which we'll activate a tube rotation and wake the animals up. So our animals really factually had a probably 99% reduction in sleep amount. And I would say you could argue that the reason why they don't die, or at least males don't die, is because in that little percentage of sleep that they can still have, can still accomplish the vital function of sleep. And so that is really, again, is helpful to think about what we see in these terms.
Yeah, and also the beautiful instrument that you created, that's, if you just describe it a little bit, that how you could kind of remove that stressful environment when it comes to introduce sleep deprivation.
Yeah, so when I started my postdoc, as I said, it was in 2006, and it was early days for the field of sleep in Drosophila. The first papers formally describing sleep in Drosophila were published only in 2000. And so there were still very few laboratories studying this question. And obviously the techniques were also rather, primitive, I would say, at the beginning. Obviously, you start with what you have. What the field had was a system that was borrowed from circadian science. It's a system actually that was developed by Simon Benzer in the 60s. At least conceptually. What Benzer did, he wanted to study circadian biology as a way to study how genetics control behaviors. And so he was putting pupae in a spectrophotometer. So now when the imago, when the adult fly would emerge out of the pupal case, it will then interfere with the UV ray or infrared ray of the spectrophotometer, and the thicker will record that something had happened. So this was really probably the first attempt at automatically quantifying behavior in any animal, and that was done by the genius Benza. And and so then this thing evolved into something we call an activity monitor, which is a system basically where flies are in, let's see if I have an example here. Yeah, not really, but yeah, so flies are in a small glass tube about this size. And so you put the flies into the glass tube, and you have cotton on one end and you have food on the other end. And all the fly can do in this tube is moving back and forth. And so if you have an infrared beam going through the middle of the tube and connected to a computer, you can then record every time the fly is breaking this invisible infrared beam. And you can therefore use this as a measure of activity. And this system has been used by the people studying circadian biology for many years. It's pretty good for circadian biology. In fact, it's good enough that allowed those people to win 3 Nobel Prizes. So I would argue that a system that's good enough to win 3 Nobel Prizes is a good system, but it doesn't really apply very well to sleep. And the reason is that if the fly is staying away from the infrared beam, eating or grooming or just thinking about the future, then you will underestimate sleep amount. And so we spent quite a bit of time creating a system that will not use any of these reductionist approaches, and we went for video recording, video tracking, in fact, real-time video tracking. And so we're using this, I have one here actually, a system like this one, which is a Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi is connected to a camera, and the camera looks down where the flies are. And so now we have basically a computer. Raspberry Pi is a microcomputer that 24/7 will look at the flies, and based on then machine learning will understand whether the flies are awake or asleep. And the good thing about this is that it's completely independent. So you can have as many machines as you want, because all the computation is done by the Raspberry Pi itself. So all the Raspberry Pi does is connects to the Wi-Fi and sends data to a central computer, which then collects data, but the computation is distributed. And so when the computation is distributed, it means that it scales up very easily. And so we have, like more than 100 of these devices. And the other good thing is that because it operates in real time, now what you can do is you can have the Raspberry Pi link to a Arduino, which is a commonly used microprocessor, and the Arduino can then be driving a robot, and the robot can do anything you want. We can use the robot to keep the flies awake by interfering with them, by just pushing them when they fall asleep. We can use the robot to give the flies, for instance, olfactory stimuli, and so challenge them with odors which are different in quality rather than quantity. We can use robots to give them light. So for instance, to activate optogenetically some neurons or inactivate other neurons. So there is really no limit to what you can use this system for. And it's been, as you say, it's been extremely instrumental for us, but also just for the field, I would say, because then it opens to all these new opportunities, not just better tracking, more faithful tracking of sleep amounts, but also interference with sleep and interference with the activity of the animals.
Exactly. And one of the this really interesting observation that you mentioned previously is that even when you reduce the sleep, still there was no effect on longevity of the fruit flies, right? So even if, let's say, we say that they could have snatched 1 to 2% of sleep, which is still significantly reduced amount of sleep. So how do we then look at it? Or could you also see any kind of these functional related problems in these flies, or even those things were not there?
So we are looking at that. We are trying to understand whether there is having found out that you can remove as much sleep as you want and the flies will not die. We are looking at then what are the consequences of sleep deprivation, and why then flies don't just always stay awake. And one first thing we found is that actually some flies do always stay awake. So we did find that even in the wild-type conditions, you have individuals, few obviously, but some exist that sleep very, very little. So, a sleep amount in a population is like a normal distribution, and you have tails, and some of those tails will sleep a lot, and some others will sleep very little. In fact, we found flies that sleep a few minutes a day. So again, that tells us that it is naturally possible for these animals to almost forgo completely all their sleep. There's also mutants, so flies that have specific mutation in certain genes where we see exactly the same thing. So there's a mutant, for instance, in the dopamine transporter, which is a important neurotransmitter regulating sleep, among the other things. And in this mutant, again, we see basically no sleep or a few minutes of sleep a day, and yet these animals they can live for as long as the wild-type counterparts. And so we are approaching this by again by looking at an evolutionary point of view. So comparing, for instance, in a kind of natural environment, how do different animals that sleep different amount compete with each other? Which ones will have more fitness? And it's always difficult to obviously recreate a proper natural environment in the lab. So that's part of the challenges associated with these questions and with these experiments. It's difficult to introduce really the real dangers that you have in the lab, for instance, predation or weather. It is possible that a fly that sleep very little will just have very high fitness, in fact, in the lab, but reduced fitness in the wild. So one has to account for those opportunities. And we're also looking at how sleep is conserved across different Drosophila species. Now, we all know that Drosophila is an excellent animal model to study neuroscience. One thing that I think we will be discovering in the next few years, or some already discovering this, is that Drosophila is also an excellent model to study the evolution of the nervous system in general, because we start having lots of data about other species which are not melanogaster. And obviously, the genetic tools that we have from melanogaster are much wider and much more powerful, but we are now, I think one thing that CRISPR did is put us in the position of starting creating those tools also in other species. And we obviously have genome alignments information and genome sequences information from all those other species. So we can really start comparing evolution at the level that was not possible before. Another way to look at this again is to go back to sleep deprivation in a more acute system and look at what are the cognitive performances that change. And there's lots of literature from Paul Shaw and Van Zinstra and James. So a lot of laboratories looked at this and show that even flies do pay some kind of cognitive price for sleep deprivation. The question is why? Why do flies and why do humans have a different cognitive performance after losing sleep? And I think there's two ways against to frame two hypotheses that one could put forward. One is that sleep does something, and then when you remove that function, then there is some kind of damage at the level of the brain, at the level of the connection, whatever you want to call it. But the other aspect is that removal of sleep triggers a homeostatic regulation that will force you to recover that sleep you've lost, at least partly. It's in fact always partly, and that is a very interesting aspect. In practice, what happens is that you lose sleep, and then as a consequence, you will be more sleepy. And that is the sleepiness itself that then has an effect on your cognitive performance. So you are not reducing your cognitive performance because you're missing one of the functions of sleep. You're reducing your cognitive performance because your brain makes you sleepy, and that sleepiness has an impact on your cognitive performance. So that's one way that things could go. And we have some evidence that this actually is partly the case in animals, in flies, but also in humans. So humans who are awake for instance, while they run ultramarathons or events which are extremely demanding, they don't have a huge deal of decline in cognitive performance. Same with flies. Not all flies that are sleep deprived will have a decline in cognitive performance. And another thing we've seen this is a famous experiment was run in the 60s on humans. In fact, it's known as the Randy Gardner experiment. Randy Gardner was a high school student in America, in the United States. He wanted to participate with an experiment to a school fair, and also at the same time break one of the records on the Guinness Book of Records. And so he stayed awake for 11 days in a row, while friends and doctors were making sure that he would really be awake, and at the same time were monitoring his performance, cognitive performance, physical performance. And throughout these 11 days, he had moments which were quite scary. So moments where he was hallucinating, moments where he was particularly aggressive, anxious, but most of the time he was actually fine, especially in the morning when the circadian rhythm is pushing up our activity, endogenous activity pattern. He could play chess just fine. He could, have conversations. He could play basketball just fine. In fact, William Dement, who was one of the scientists who was following him during this experiment, he said that he would play basketball even better than when he was rested. And so, yeah, this cognitive decline is not linear. It doesn't correlate with the amount of sleep we lose. It might not always be there. And so I think it's legitimate to ask ourselves, is it really due to the lack of sleep, or is it really more of a consequence that of the fact that our endogenous homeostatic regulator wants us to be sleepy just because it wants to punish us for having lost some sleep?
Yeah, but then also these Matthew Walker and the other scientists, they come and they start claiming about, that you need at least 8 hours sleep, and there is this less testosterone, etc. So if you don't sleep properly, this is low and that is low, and etc. etc.
Yeah.
So what is from where these observations are coming?
So let's be straight about one fact. If I miss one full night of sleep and then I go drive a car, I'll probably kill myself. Okay, so there are consequences of missing sleep, and then the point is that biologically speaking, we can argue whether those consequences are really due to the fact that we are missing something, or rather they are due to the fact that we are extremely sleepy. If you have a very heavy meal at lunch, like one of these Italian weddings kind of things, you'll be very sleepy afterwards. You get into this postprandial state, and that is independent of your regular sleep homeostasis. And then again, if you drive after having had a very heavy meal, you'll probably kill yourself because you tend to fall asleep at the wheel. And so again, that shows that you're not necessarily in danger because you have lost sleep, but you're in danger because you are sleepy. So that's one of the first aspects that we have to discuss when we discuss chronic sleep deprivation, acute sleep deprivation. With chronic sleep deprivation is yet another reason that can be done. It's true that lack of sleep is problematic for most people. I have 2 children myself. I went through stages where I was sleeping very little, and those are times that are problematic for many reasons. You feel like you decide you want to sleep more and so on, and you decide and you realize that there is something wrong with your body, with yourself, when you don't do. Some people also are chronically, suffering from insomnia, and they feel the same way. They'll just, crave sleep, even though they cannot get enough. And when these people go to see a sleep doctor, the first thing that a sleep doctor will say is, it doesn't matter. Don't put too much thoughts into it. Don't stress yourself with the fact that you cannot sleep. Try not to, enter into this vicious circle where during the night you are worried because you cannot sleep, and because you are worried you cannot sleep. Okay, because this vicious circle will just hurt you and will just basically make the situation worse. And so when you do this, what happens is that these people, they do not necessarily sleep longer, but they feel better. If they really manage to enter into this mindset, then they'll do fine, they do better. They may be not completely okay, but they are much, much better than what they used to be, even though they're having the same amount of sleep. And so that nails down just to the fact that, I can't sleep in bed, that's fine. Instead of rolling around and crying, I will just read a book or something like that. So you get the same amount of sleeping hours, but you reduce your stress amount. And so again, I think it's inevitable and undeniable that there is a component of sleep deprivation that really increases your stress. And then we know that stress has a negative effect on our health. So everything, all those important consequences of sleep deprivation might as well simply be due to stress itself. The other aspect to underline is that often the reason why we lose sleep is because we're stressed out to start with. You might have problems at work, you might have problems with your partner, you might be in love with someone who doesn't love you back. All this kind of reasoning then make you lose your healthy sleep. And so again, it becomes a co-factoring, right? So why are you then suffering? Is it because you're losing sleep, or because you are driven by this stress component? So it's difficult to disentangle, and I will really caveat against it, to disentangle the effect of lack of sleep from the effects of stress that either causes lack of sleep or is caused by lack of sleep. The two things really go together very, very closely. And then you might argue about, well, all right, and if we don't really sleep, if we don't really need most of this sleep, as you said, why do we, why our body feel the urge to make us sleepy? Why does our body want us to sleep 8 hours a day if we don't have to sleep 8 hours a day? And again, because sleeping 8 hours a day is evolutionary appropriate for our species. And so there is a gauge, there is an amount of sleep that is set for our species, and that is about 8 hours a day, with variability. Again, some people need 5 hours, some people need 12 hours. And so once your body has set that gauge, that's how homeostasis works. It will try to maintain level at that level, at that amount. Think about food. If I skip a meal for a day or two, I won't die. I have enough reserve in my body to do without a meal for a day or two. But I will be very hungry. And if I am overweight, like I was at one point in my life, and I'm very overweight, and I go into a diet, I will feel still very hungry. So even though I have lots of reserves, and my body still can provide all the energy I want for more than just a couple of days, my homeostatic gauge will tell me, what are you doing? You really need to eat this, this croissant, because you really need it, and if you don't eat it, you will die, even though it's not true. And so something similar might apply to our sleep regulation, because that, the moment a biological drive is set, there has to be a way to maintain it. On the other hand, if we didn't have any way to punish us from lack of sleep, then we will not sleep 8 hours a day, right? If you let's try to agree that a bat does not really need all those 20 hours of sleep, okay, with something easy to agree on. So let's agree that many of these 20 years of sleep that the bat does and the bat has are not really needed biologically speaking. Well, now the question is, if I sleep deprive a bat a little bit and I let the bat sleep 16 hours or 15 hours instead of 20, will the bat be more tired the day after? And the answer has to be yes, because otherwise the bat will sleep 15 hours to start with, okay? So even to maintain any amount of sleep, even if you don't need it biologically, you must have a system that punishes you when you don't reach that level.
Yeah, and so when we talk about humans, which are, I mean, in a way that we can think of humans as your fruit flies, basically isolated in the lab, right? Because now we are kind of quite secure in our daily lifestyle. Of course, the lifestyle has changed a lot, and we have changed many things in our natural environment, right? So in that case, whether we need those hours. So let's say if I start training myself, and start decreasing the amount of sleep slowly, maybe in 20 years, do you think that only 3 or 4 hours would be enough rather than 8 hours, something like that?
Well, I think that the issue here, it goes back to the fact that most of the sleep is controlled by the circadian rhythm. And the circadian rhythm, as we said at the beginning, is something that is almost written in stone. So it's very difficult to convince your circadian rhythm that it has to change. And so I don't think at the level of the single individual, one can count on that, can count on training yourself to sleep less. You do sleep less with time. You do sleep less with age. Sleep is definitely is linked to our age. When we sleep much longer when we are babies and children than when we are elderlies. The difference is really in terms of many hours. So there is some plasticity associated with a regulation of sleep amount. An elderly person can sleep easily, 6 hours a day. And the same person, when they were a boy or a child, they would sleep 12 or 13 hours a day. So there is some change that is intrinsic to our biology, but I don't think it can be forced or retrained. At least that's not something we see from the literature. There are cases which are not very well studied in the lab of people, of a community of people, let's say, that it became a bit more visible nowadays with the internet. And these are people who train themselves to do something called polyphasic sleep. So these are normally people who just want to be more productive during the day, as in having more time to do stuff. Okay. And that's another interesting aspect of looking at sleep. And I open a parenthesis here, we tend to anthropomorphize our concept of sleep a lot. So we say that often that sleep is kind of lost time, and that one famous quote is that if sleep has no function, then this is the biggest mistake that evolution has ever made. And this quote arises if we see at sleep in terms of time that we lose from doing something else. But this doing something else is a very modern concept. So it is a very modern and human concept, that the time that we don't do sleep is better used doing something else. If you think of animals, it's not like in the time they are awake, they do lots of stuff. At the end of the day, they either go and look for food if they need some, but if they don't need to have, if they don't need to have food, if they don't need to drink, if they don't need to mate because they are not in the right time of their year or time of the month or whatever, then there's not much more than an animal will do. Socialization is something that is, a peculiarity of some animals, but definitely not many. Think of a cat. A cat is having a lot of cat naps, and during the time they spend awake, it's not like they are reading and writing and creating arts or things that we normally associate to ourselves. So this idea that basically time spent as sleep is time that is stolen from productive Leonardo da Vinci kind of activities is very anthropomorphic, and even it doesn't even apply to most humans, I would say, right? Most humans, the time that they spend awake is spent at the end of the day in front of the TV set. So that's closing the parenthesis. So, but there's some people want, for legitimate reasons, they want to announce and increase the amount of time that they are awake and being productive in the way they prefer. And so they try this polyphasic sleep, and they sleep basically very little throughout the 24 hours. They sleep maybe 6 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours a day. But they sleep at continuous intervals. Like they might sleep at 2 hours during the night, and then 1 hour for a nap, and then 1 hour again. So often what they do this at regular intervals. So they might sleep like 1 hour every 8 hours that they spend awake. And this is a phenomenon that is it's quite popular in some these clubs on the internet, but it's definitely not studied at the clinical level, at the scientific level, and it's a pity. I think there is something that can be learned from these people.
And is there any study where they've shown, especially in humans, where someone died because of sleep deprivation?
So no, there's no study where this was done, and for obvious ethical reason, you will have to keep someone awake until he dies, and unless you are a psychopath, you won't be able to do this. There's some report of people who died out of sleep deprivation during the Spanish Inquisition, but again, I wouldn't call that an experiment. Obviously, these people were torture, and they might as well die in the same way these dogs were dying, just out of torture and stress. Your brain starts to degenerate at a very fast pace to an extent that is not compatible with life. So all prion disease eventually will lead to death. But this prion disease change in the way that some affect some area of the brain, and some other diseases affect other areas of the brain. So it's interesting because it's usually the same gene, the same protein that's affected, but depending on where the protein is mutated, then you have different anatomopathological signs and different diseases at the end. And so this fatal familial insomnia is a disease that basically hits a particular area of the brain that regulates sleep. And so at one point, you stop sleeping basically when you have this disease, and you might be going without sleep for months. Eventually, you'll die. And some people claim that you die because you are chronically sleep deprived. But we must remember that this disease that causes a massive neurodegeneration of the brain, and that all prions disease eventually lead to death. So you die because your brain is dying. You're dying because the disease is eating a good chunk of your brain. If you recreate the molecular condition of this disease in a rodent animal, in a rodent model, they also die, but they don't have any lack of sleep. In fact, in some cases, they even sleep longer. So it shows that you still have neurodegeneration, but it's probably just neurodegeneration in a different area that does not control sleep, and that leads to death eventually. So the evidence that animals will eventually die after sleep deprivations are extremely weak. It's really just, humans will die after sleep deprivation are extremely weak. It's really just this case, this condition, and I don't think there is really any opportunity to call this an evidence.
Yeah, actually this was my next question, whether there is any link between sleep and neurodegeneration, because the scientists that they are working on neurodegeneration, they call it, especially the coming time, that epidemic of neurodegeneration, especially when we are working for the longevity of humans, etc. So is there any correlation there?
There's definitely some clinical correlation. For instance, changes in sleep pattern are some of the first ones to be observed in people with dementia. Sometimes even before the cognitive decline, what you do see is a change in sleep pattern. You start seeing normally either less sleep or more sleep. There's several laboratories who investigate this aspect. I think it's still early days. One interesting hypothesis of sleep function, of this vital function of sleep, has to do with clearance of metabolite and toxins out of the intracellular space in the brain. And people who push for this hypothesis claim that this has a role in cleaning, for instance, from proteins that would otherwise cause neurodegenerative conditions. So they say if you don't clean enough of these proteins out of the extracellular space, you will end up with neurodegeneration. And so sleep is helping in this sense. I think it's still very early days. I'm personally not convinced that any of these links are actually real. There's, as usual, the many confounding factors which are very difficult to account for. So it will take some more science to convince me, at least.
Yeah, since throughout the conversation we were talking about sleep and the animal behavior related to animal, so it seems like that it is a behavior or a phenomena related to the brain. So of course the other questions that generally people ask is do plants sleep? So what's the research there?
Yeah, so well, this goes back to basically what we said at the very beginning, that because we don't have a function of, biological function of sleep, we don't have a biological description of the function of sleep. We have to use behavioral correlates. That's the best we can do. The moment you use behavioral correlates, you obviously limit yourself to species who have some kind of behavior of this kind. So people look at animals. So I would say the only fair answer to your question on whether plants sleep is that we don't know, because we don't know what sleep is. If we find out that sleep is a process that requires, some basic biological function and that does this or that, then yes, we might be able to study whether the same process happens in plants as well. And we might be able to say, yes, plants sleep, or no, plants do not sleep. But obviously, if we rely on behavioral correlates and things that have to do with activity and homeostasis above everything else, then it becomes very difficult to study this in plants. But then on the other hand, you could argue, some plants do show behavioral correlates of sleep. They might be closing their leaves during the night. And so that's a sign of, different sign of activity. There might even be homeostatic control of this. So if you disturb this process, they try to control it in a homeostatic fashion. And obviously, they do have a very well-studied and functioning circadian rhythm. So it's really one of those aspects that nails down to definitions and to general acceptance from the field. I don't think it's a taboo question. I think it's a very smart, intelligent question to ask whether plants, or why not even yeast, might sleep or not. Do single cells sleep, right? I mean, do we need to have a fully connected functioning brain to show sleep? Or if it is really a biological function, a basic biological function, you would expect the single cells also should be able to sleep one way or another. So it's very fundamental question. It's very difficult, and I think it's the kind of question that goes in the right direction. I think it's the kind of question we should be asking if we really want to address the function of sleep.
Yeah, I would replace this unknown with another unknown, which is consciousness. So if you think of sleep as loss of consciousness, what's your understanding there?
So one of the definitions of consciousness is exactly this: it says that consciousness is anything that goes when we are in our dreamless sleep. It's an interesting definition of consciousness. It's incomplete, I think, because during sleep, during most of sleep at least, we still maintain a level of consciousness. I would say during all of sleep, actually. We obviously might lose self-awareness if we really are in dreamless sleep, if there is such a thing as dreamless sleep. I don't know if there is such a thing as dreamless sleep. There is definitely lack of dream in your memories, but I don't know whether there is such a thing as dreamless sleep. But let's say that there is, and consciousness disappear. Well, so again, it becomes a matter of definition, because I will argue that there is a lot of your brain that still works and is still conscious. For instance, your brain still has to be aware of its surrounding. Your brain has to recognize stimuli coming from the outside. If I call your name, say Jitender, while you are asleep, you will wake up. If I call somebody else's name while you're asleep, you will not wake up. So that means that during your sleep, even during your dreamless sleep, there is a portion of your brain that is listening to the environment and deciding whether a stimulus coming in is a meaningful stimulus or not, and then deciding whether they should act by waking you up or not. So that portion of the brain is conscious. And so it's wrong to say that that consciousness is gone during dreamless sleep. We can say that most consciousness might be gone, but then again, if you might be in your deepest sleep, and if I pull your leg, you'll wake up. So there is a portion of your brain that is receiving sensory information. If you fall from the bed, like push you down the bed, you'll wake up. So proprioception is sensed by a portion of your brain, and it will consciously, interfere. So I think one of the problems of consciousness is that it's a field where, again, people have not agreed on basic definitions of the problem. To me, consciousness is something which is very modular, and my best definition of consciousness is that consciousness is anything that the brain does. And so clearly, because the brain is active during sleep by doing all these things, still there is consciousness during sleep. But what we can do is we can start dissecting these modules. We can start separating, for instance, consciousness and the conscious analysis of the visual system, which is clearly affected during sleep, or we can start looking at self-awareness and things like this. We can start modulating those out. And that's something we started doing, studying exactly this, how the brain perceives sensory stimuli during sleep.
Yeah, this I generally see that, just because, of course we have science in humans, but then of course we have language, which sometimes also make things complicated, right? The fact that if we can't agree on certain semantics, certain definitions, which generally happens on these kind of abstract properties that we are trying to study, like sleep or consciousness. But one thing I think that really makes sense is so if we say that sleep or consciousness is brain related or neurons related property, that somehow already limits it to certain species, right? Rather than thinking about at the I don't know, like with plants or other species.
Oh yes, of course. The definitions that we choose will limit our own hypothesis, basically. I remember at the beginning I said that some people in the 1900s, even late in the 1900s, they thought that insects do not sleep, and insects rest. They don't really have sleep, but they have something which they call rest. It's really an arbitrary choice to put a boundary at that point and say, anything above this line is sleep, anything below this line is not, it's just rest. It's a completely arbitrary point, and it will massively affect your hypothesis and your findings, right? Especially for something which is as evolutionary puzzling and conserved as sleep. But the truth is that most of sleep science in the previous century was driven by electrophysiology. So by sticking electrodes in an animal's brain or scalp and studying brain waves. And so it came natural to many scientists simply to say, well, if I can find these brain waves, it's because this must not be sleep. Because sleep is characterized by these brain waves. So if there are no brain waves, then that's not sleep. But that's, again, a completely arbitrary definition of sleep. There are many biological correlates of sleep, right? And many of these are evolutionarily conserved. For instance, sexual arousal and penile erection, right? Most mammals have penile erections in some phases of sleep, where you're unconsciously sexually aroused. And most humans, they wake up in a condition like this in the morning. That is conserved with mammals. It is even conserved with platypus. So platypus have penile erection during sleep. So would you say that the definition of sleep requires this conserved phenomenon, to be considered sleep? It would be crazy. So if I were to go to a meeting and say, I think for something to be called sleep, you must have penile erection, people will think I'm crazy. But if I go and say, for something to be called sleep, you must have non-REM waves in the brain, that is completely normal and acceptable. And I think it's almost at the same level. It's completely arbitrary and completely misleading, in fact, because you then start narrowing yourself to a definition that you just made up, and it might take you astray.
Yeah, this is, I think, a great example. Okay, so what else? What other literature do you recommend for people to read?
Well, I personally moved away from the classical sleep literature and start looking at it in terms of evolution. So I think it's ecology and evolution are really the aspects that are driving my thoughts at the moment. I think it's also very important to understand the concept of homeostasis in terms of general homeostasis. What is homeostasis in biological terms? So how is any of our biological activity homeostatically regulated? And I often make comparison between sleep and food, because food is another drive that is biologically regulated in a similar way. It has a homeostatic control. It has a circadian control. The difference clearly is that we know what sleep does. We know what food does, right? We know that you ingest some food and then that will translate into calories. And we have a very deep understanding of what it means and what you do with those calories. So I think it's ideally we will get there with sleep as well. We will get to a point where we will have some kind of understanding that is similar to the one of food. And interestingly, when you think about food, obviously food is vital, right? If you don't eat, you die eventually. So there is a vital component. Those calories are needed to keep your cells alive. But it's not the only function of food. There is also a useful component, right? If you really want to have extra calories because you're training for a marathon or something like this, then you will have to add more calories to it. There is also some homeostatically regulated accessory food amount, which is the one that makes us go overweight, as I said, right? Once you get the homeostatic level to overweight, you will maintain the homeostatic level to overweight. Even though you don't need those calories, you will just increase your weight. So there are many comparisons between food and sleep in this sense. So to answer your question, I don't really know what kind of literature I would recommend. I think it's I will try to push for people to explore literature and connections which are not obvious. So I will not say, obviously there is lots to be learned from very old literature, so that is aspect is interesting, but I will definitely say do not pay too much attention. That's what I do, at least, to literature that is heavily focused on electrophysiology, because let's remember that electrophysiology is just a correlate, just like behavioral correlates, we have electrophysiological correlates. and instead, a lot of the literature in the past century got really lost in the tiniest details of electrophysiology, try to understand why this brain wave is like this instead of like that, and why you have this spindle, and what is the function of the spindle. There might not be any. It might just be just a correlative thing. But if there is some, it might be marginal, or it might be specific to some individuals, or it might be specific to some species. So.
Yeah, I had one conversation with Paul Chisek in Montreal. So he talks about this thing that neuroscience needs evolution. And so we had about 3 hours conversation. We were talking about different examples where he was trying to explain that how different organisms and still there is not much change in terms of neurons and the like brain in general when we look at different species across the evolutionary tree.
Yeah, I totally agree. The neuroscience really has to be understood in the light of evolution, like most of biology, after all. Another aspect that neuroscience really can benefit from is reductionism. So there's been a switch at one point, a shift at one point, and lots of our neuroscience is now focused on humans and complex brains, and the idea that we need to connect them of the human brain, and we need to understand the human brain, and to understand the human brain, we must study the human brain. I think this is bullshit. I think you really need to nail down to the basic, simplest problem you can solve. That's really why biology has made the progress it has made so far, because we went on, every single field of biology went on like this. We started with the simplest problem, we cracked the simplest problem, and then we extracted the basic principle, the first principle, and we applied it to more complex system. And even neuroscience used to do this. If you think about the Nobel Prize for Learning and Memory and for molecular mechanism of learning and memory, they came from one of the simplest animals you can think of, which is a slug, a plesia. We have to go back to that thinking, I think. We have to go back to a system where we appreciate reductionism as the best way to understand the problem. If you want to understand how a computer works, you start from the simplest computer you can find around. You don't start with the more complex computer that NASA has. That would be crazy, right? You start with the simplest thing, and then you build your way up. That's our understanding works from when we are children. So the fact that now we are doing the opposite, we're starting with the most complex brain we know of, which is the human brain, it's completely absurd.
Understanding human brain is bullshit. I think let's think that, or let's say that this comment is for the scientists, but for the taxpayers, we can maybe we can talk about so for example, how many hours do you sleep, and what you can recommend in terms of lifestyle if people they want to think about their sleep cycle?
My sleep amount varies a lot, like I guess everybody else. At one point, obviously, I was using this activity monitors and Fitbits and all these kind of things. So just out of curiosity, and that is when I realized that I can go from anything between 4 hours a night to 9 hours a night. One interesting thing that I experienced lately is that, and matches completely what we see with our flies, is that my ability to stay awake really depends on what I'm doing. If I sit in front of the TV set and watch a Netflix movie, 99% I will fall asleep. Maybe not 99, but it's difficult to find a movie that excites me. On the other end, so basically I'm off by 9:30 in the night and I'm off to bed. If I play PlayStation, I can stay up until the morning, and I can do that for days and days in a row, and stay up until, sometimes I look at my watch and it's 5 o'clock, and the only reason why I'm going upstairs is because I know that my wife will be upset if I don't. But and we see the same with flies. With flies, we see that the way we used to keep them asleep has a massive influence on the rebound the day after. Some ways will cause rebound, some other ways will not cause rebound. And that's wild-type flies. We're not talking about mutants. So yeah, my sleep amount varies, and it also varies depending on what I do and I will enjoy the time that I spend awake. Suggestion to improve sleep, there are many. I would say one important one is targeted to parents, actually, not to regular adults. So a very common mistake that parents make is that they think their children might be afraid of darkness and they must sleep with a little light in the room. And so they buy these lights out of Amazon and they put them in the room, and the room of the child is never dark. And these children, they have problems with sleep because their circadian rhythm is heavily perturbed. Light is the best way to perturb and screw up your circadian rhythm. So absolutely, I would say get rid of those. First of all, the idea that children are afraid of darkness is a total artifact, is a social construct that doesn't exist. We are not afraid of darkness unless you teach your children that they should be afraid of darkness by having a light. So that is a major mistake, because you unconsciously communicate a fear to your children that they didn't have until that point. And secondly, you are disturbing their sleep massively because you're interacting with the circadian clock, which we know is something you cannot play with because it's very, very, it doesn't really have much plasticity. By disturbing the sleep pattern, you are disturbing your own sleep pattern, you're sleeping less. So definitely, modifying circadian rhythm is really one of the most common mistakes that people make when they interfere with the sleep. In this case, with their children's sleep, but also with our sleep. So, having a TV set in the bedroom, using the computer at night, using a phone at night. These are all absolutely brilliant ways to disturb your sleep. So those are the things that I would definitely recommend acting on immediately.
Okay, perfect. So with that, thank you so much for accepting the invitation, coming onto the podcast and discussing different aspects of sleep. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It was fun.